Okay, here we are, everybody. This is going to be the first video in a series of the urinary system. This is a new unit, so we just finished with digestive and digestive and metabolism, and now we're moving into urinary, and the next chapter is fluid balance. So this chapter, urinary, and the next one, fluid balance, are going to go together. So get ready to switch gears. Also, due to some technical difficulties, this is my third time attempting to record this. I'm just going to be recording in about 30-minute segments. I'm hoping that I'll be able to save the videos better. So we'll do half-an-hour chunks, which I believe the urinary system, we might need 4 half-an-hour videos. We'll just take it as it goes, all right? Okay. I always start this chapter with a question. You've probably heard of diabetes mellitus. That's what you think of with diabetes, which is a problem with regulating blood glucose levels. But there's also a diabetes insipidus, which you may not have heard of. Diabetes insipidus involves a deficiency of anti-diuretic hormone, or ADH, which, as we know, ADH is our water-retaining hormone. So if our kidneys aren't able to absorb enough water, what's going to happen is we're going to end up peeing out a lot of that water that we would have otherwise been reabsorbing. And one of the cardinal symptoms of diabetes insipidus is excessive urination. So, my question to you, just to introduce this chapter, and let me go to the black pen here. Boom. How much could someone urinate if they have diabetes insipidus? Could it be as much as 6 liters? That would equal 3 2-liter bottles. Could it be a 1-gallon cleaning bucket? Or could someone urinate as much as a 10-gallon joint compound bucket? This is not going to be on the test. Just a little thing to get our brains going. The answer is, in extreme cases, someone could pee out as much as 10 gallons. Can you imagine peeing as much in one day to fill up a 10-gallon joint compound bucket? Woof. You can see our normal urine output, and we'll talk about this more later in this chapter. Our normal urine output is about 1 to 2 liters per day. So usually it's much less than a 10-gallon joint compound bucket. But enough of the trickery. Let's get into this chapter. Okay, so we'll start with the functions. Then we're going to go through the anatomy. So probably the first 2 30-minute videos will be the functions and a lot of the anatomy. And then the 3rd and 4th video, we'll spend a lot more time on urine formation. And of course, our lovely friend, regulation, how these processes are regulated. All right. If we look at a general view of the urinary system, here's what we see. We've got 2 kidneys. You know about those, right? 1 on each side. The left kidney is a little bit higher than the right. The tube that leads from the kidney to the bladder is called the ureter. Then we have the bladder, which is the holding tank for the urine. And then we have the urethra, which is the exit point of the urine. This is a female, so it's a shorter urethra. The male is a little bit different. Okay. What you'll notice is on this PowerPoint, things are not highlighted in red, but not to worry. As I go through these videos, you're going to see me circling what you need to know. So as long as you're paying attention, and however you do it in your own notes, you're circling what I'm circling, so you know what you need to know. All right, good. Now, before we get deeper into the anatomy and the functions, it wouldn't be me if I didn't talk about this. We already know body systems don't work independently. Body systems work together, and it's no different for the urinary system. I'm going to circle 2 of these that I'd like you to review. So if we think about what is it that has a shared function between the respiratory and the urinary system. On first glance, you might not think that they have a lot in common or that they share a common function, respiratory and urinary. But they actually do. And maybe you're with me, maybe you're ahead of the game. You may remember from the respiratory system, and I did mention it then, both the respiratory and the urinary systems help to regulate pH. Of course, the respiratory system did it through release of CO2. And what we're going to find is in the urinary system, we can help to regulate pH by releasing more or less hydrogen ions in the urine. All right, so the respiratory and the urinary system both play a major role in regulating the blood pH. In terms of the reproductive system, this is an anatomical connection between the reproductive and urinary. And this would only be true in the males, and more specifically, the male urethra. So the male urethra at times can be a passageway for urine, so that is the urinary system function, and other times the urethra can be a passageway for semen during ejaculation. That, of course, would be the reproductive function. So this is unique to males. The urethra is a shared passageway, sometimes for urine, and at different times semen. I love this cartoon here. Hello, Incontinence Helpline, can you hold please? Incontinence, hold please, ha ha ha. All right, let's talk about the functions of the urinary system. Okay, the first two we are probably already familiar with. The urinary system helps to filter blood. The urinary system helps us to form urine. It should be number 1, number 2, and number 3, but the autocorrect just didn't like me. So the urinary system, the kidneys in particular, filter blood and form urine. But another really important function of the urinary system is to maintain homeostasis. We just talked about how the urinary system helps to maintain homeostasis of pH. Well, the urinary system can also maintain homeostasis of so many things. Blood volume. And then a bunch of solutes. So because the kidneys produce urine, they have the ability to put whatever the body needs into the urine for disposal. So in that way, it helps to regulate levels of red blood cells, ions like sodium, and glucose. If we have too much glucose in the body, what's an easy way to get rid of it? To pee it out. And it's the kidneys that can do that. I want to make another note. This is not going to be on the test, but the kidneys themselves are able to produce 2 hormones, erythropoietin and renin. Again, not going to be on the test. That's a really bad kidney. You've come to expect bad drawings from me, so why would this be any different? We have the kidney, and what we're going to talk about later this semester in the endocrine system chapter is there are the adrenal glands that sit like little hats on top of the kidneys, the adrenal glands. And these adrenal glands produce a bunch of very important hormones: cortisol, glucocorticoids, epinephrine, norepinephrine. But I'm talking about the kidney itself, okay? The kidney itself is actually able to produce 2 hormones. Again, won't be on the test, but we have to connect the dots here. Come on now. So we mentioned erythropoietin way back in the blood chapter, EPO. You may remember. EPO is a hormone, now we know produced in the kidneys, goes to the red bone marrow and signals the red bone marrow to produce blood cells. Renin, we talked about that too in the blood vessel chapter, because renin is a hormone released by the kidneys that plays a role in blood pressure regulation. You may recall, if blood pressure drops to dangerously low levels, the kidneys will release renin. Renin is eventually converted into angiotensin II, and then angiotensin II goes on to do a bunch of things to increase blood pressure back to normal. Won't be on the test, the hormones, but just wanted to point it out. Okay, there are so many shared functions that there's a whole little chart here. This is all extra, but wanted to drive home the point. Body systems work together. All right, let's get into the anatomy. We talked about the functions. Let's talk about the anatomy. On this particular slide, you really don't have to know anything on the left. You can read the kidneys are retroperitoneal. They have a kidney bean shape. They have connective tissue coverings, like every other organ. You don't have to know the specific names of the connective tissue coverings. I just feel like there's more important things for us to know. I do want to point out from the pictures, we see a good look at the adrenal gland. So I just talked before that sitting on top of each kidney is an adrenal gland. It's yellow. Okay. Also from these pictures, we can see that the left kidney is positioned a little bit higher than the right. And the last thing I want to point out is the rib cage is able to protect a portion of the kidneys. But as you can see, the lower half of the kidneys, if not more on the right kidney, is not protected by the rib cage. And therefore, those lower regions of the kidneys are more prone to damage from trauma. All right, now let's really get into it. Let's talk about the anatomy of the kidneys. Okay, we're going to talk about first the renal cortex and the renal medulla. The kidney has two regions. The outermost region is called the renal cortex, and it's just this outer region here. We may remember that cortex means outer. We talked about the cerebral cortex. No different here. The renal cortex means the outer region. So if I was to shade this in, the region that I'm shading in is the renal cortex. I have to laugh. I'm sorry. This view, I think you can probably see it just like I can. The top, we have a view from the previous slide of the butt cheeks, which sometimes you just have to laugh. You look up top there, maybe you can see it, the two butt cheeks. If you can't laugh, what's the point, right? It doesn't want me to be able to delete that either. Guess we're meant to be looking at the butt cheeks. All right, back to business. Outer region is the renal cortex. What we're going to find is that the renal cortex is really important because it is in the renal cortex that we have all the nephrons. And the nephrons are the little functional units of the kidney that do a lot of the work. So in that renal cortex are the nephrons that filter the blood and produce urine. Really important. If the renal cortex is the outer part, the renal medulla is the inner part. So the renal medulla is this inner part. Medullary means inner. So this region that I'm shading here is the renal medulla. All right. I also want to point out hilum. We saw this before in the respiratory system. Hilum means opening. Remember, the hilum in the lungs was the opening in the lungs where the bronchi and the pulmonary artery and veins enter the lungs. Well, the hilum or hilus in the kidney is the opening where the ureter and the renal artery and vein enter the kidney. As you know, I'm going to be specific if I'm asking you that. Name this opening. Last thing I want to point out on this slide is the renal sinus. So here's renal sinus. The renal sinus means depression or cavity. We had sinuses in the frontal bone and the ethmoid bone in our nasal cavity, and the sinuses were kind of cavities inside the bone. So here it's no different in terms of a sinus being a depression or cavity. The renal sinus, let me change colors because I want it to really stick out for you. Let's go with blue. The renal sinuses are these cavities here. This picture does a pretty good job of showing you in a two-dimensional way that there's a little cavity in between these yellow structures. And each individual part of those cavities, here it is in this lower picture, these cavities are called the renal sinus. Those are the butt cheeks. See what I was talking about? It's always about butt cheeks or boobs with me. I don't know. All right, let's talk about more structures of the kidney. Let's go back to the black color. Okay, we're going to be going through all of these because they're all important structures. Let's start with these three. Okay, inside the renal medulla, we have these pyramid-shaped structures called the renal pyramids. They're pyramid-shaped, so they're called renal pyramids. This top picture has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 renal pyramids. The bottom picture has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the numbers of renal pyramids in a kidney differs. I'm not going to ask you that number, but just know what it is. Pyramid-shaped structures in the medulla, renal pyramids. Then we have the renal columns. I'm going to change color again. The renal columns are the spaces in between the pyramids. Now before, I was talking about the renal sinus, which was the space down here. But now I'm not talking about the space down there anymore. I'm talking about the space further out, directly in between the renal pyramids. Okay, so the space in between the renal pyramids are the renal columns. Let's grab another color. Okay, next structure, let's use red. The next structure will be the renal papilla. The renal papilla is the point of each pyramid. So each renal pyramid comes to a point, the top of the pyramid. I think about renal papilla, P for point. So the top area of each renal pyramid is called the renal papilla. All right, good. Now I'm going to talk about some remaining structures, and I want to change the color again. Let's go to white. Now I want to talk about a series of structures, the renal pelvis, which you should know, and the major calyx and the minor calyx. I do this on purpose. So when you look at diagrams, you're going to see that some things are going to be this beige or yellowish structure. And I know it may seem obvious and I'm pointing it out, but it's going to tell us something very important. All right, let me erase this for now because I'm not quite there yet. If you see something on the screen that's a beige color, or some people might prefer to look at it as kind of a yellow. Either way, we're talking about things that filtrate flows through. Filtrate, as we're going to find out, is basically what goes on to become urine. But this is different than what's red and blue. I mean, you know this. Red is an artery, bringing blood in. Blue is a vein taking blood out. So if it's a red or a blue structure, you think automatically blood. If it's a red or a blue structure, blood is moving through it. Versus if it's a yellow or beige structure, it's filtrate moving through it. It's no longer blood moving through it, but filtrate, what's going to go on to become urine. And let's go through some of the structures that are colored to be beige or yellow. First of all, we have the ureter. And we already talked about that. The ureter is the tube that carries urine from the kidneys to the bladder. That isn't on this slide, but just wanted to review. So this is the ureter. What's a new region is the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is this collecting area right there. So it's right before we get to the ureter, okay? So that collecting space is called the renal pelvis. Then we have branches coming off of the renal pelvis. The initial branches are called the major calyces or major calyx. The initial branches are the major calyx. The secondary branches are called the minor calyces. All right, so we had the renal pelvis, this collecting spot right there. Then we had the major calyx, the first branch. And then what branches off the major calyx are the minor calyces. All right, and because these are in white, when I'm using a pen is white, but they're labeled as that beige or yellow color, we know that what's flowing through these yellow or beige structures is filtrate, what goes on to become urine. I'm going to delete this because what I want to do is I actually want to show you the real direction of flow. So the reason I did it the way I did is because sometimes I think it's easier to learn the structures the way that I showed you. But I want to make sure that we're clear on how things really work. What we're going to find is that in the renal cortex, we know the renal cortex is the outer rim, right? In the renal cortex, this is where the kidneys, the nephrons, produce urine, well, filter the blood and produce urine. So once we have urine produced by the nephrons in the renal cortex, that urine has to get out of the kidneys. And how does it get out of the kidneys? Well, the urine first flows through the renal pyramids. Then the urine flows through the minor calyx into the major calyx, into the renal pelvis, and then out of the kidney through the ureter. All right, so that's really the direction of flow. Let me say that again. Urine is going to be produced in the renal cortex, and then it travels in this direction to leave the kidneys through the renal pyramids, minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, and then ureter. Oh, such good stuff. I know you can't see me, but you can imagine how excited I am. Just wait till we get to urine formation. I may have to do some jumping jacks just to get rid of some of my excitement. All right. Now, that was talking about, I mentioned things that are shown to be yellow or beige is what filtrate goes through. But of course, we also have arteries and veins going through the kidney, and these are going to be shown, not surprisingly, as red and blue. What I want to point out here is, and again, whatever I'm circling is what you need to review, what you need to study. The kidneys at rest receive 25% of cardiac output. That is a lot. Remember, cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped out of the heart each minute. At rest, we pump out of the heart between 4 to 6 liters of blood. So at rest, 25% of that is going to the kidneys. The whole point here is that's a lot. If you think about how relatively small the kidneys are in terms of an organ, those relatively small organs at rest receive 25% of the entire body's blood supply. And that just goes to tell us how vascular the kidneys are and how much blood they filter. And this is at rest because we know during other circumstances blood is going to be shunted to other places, but at rest the body can afford to send a lot of blood to the kidneys. You can see here per minute the kidneys filter about 1,200 milliliters of blood. That's the equivalent of 1.2 liters per minute. I'm not going to ask you that number, but it is a lot. All right, let's talk about the blood supply of the kidneys. Okay. I'd like you to know all of these. Oh, gotta hit the button here. We're gonna go through all these with the exception of afferent arterial. We're gonna talk about that later. Just trying to be clear, folks. Okay, this is pretty straightforward. It's just memorization. So I'm gonna move pretty quickly. The renal artery brings blood into the kidney. Everyone knows that. The first series of branches are called the segmental arteries. Then it branches into the interlobar arteries, which then branches into the arcuate arteries, which then branches into the interlobular arteries. Okay, a couple points to help you. So we have the renal artery coming in. The first branch is the segmental, and then interlobar. The interlobar arteries are between the lobes, in this case, the renal pyramids. Interlobar, between the lobes or between the renal pyramids. The arcuate tends to form an arc around the base of the renal pyramid. And then interlobular are the teeny tiny smallest ones going into the renal cortex. Be careful because interlobar and interlobular sound similar. So just make sure you spend time with that. Interlobular are smaller, interlobular in the cortex, whereas the interlobar are in the medulla and they're between the renal pyramids. We're going to talk later about the afferent arterioles, but wait, I can hear you. I can hear you through the wonderful technology. Once we see arterioles, we know, ding, 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 arterioles have the ability to constrict and dilate. So guess what? What we're going to find out is, just like we had in many other systems, in the kidneys, we have these arterioles that have the ability to constrict and dilate. And this is one way that the kidneys can auto-regulate. They can dilate to let more blood into the nephrons in the cortex, or they can constrict to let less blood in. Oh, see how it all comes together? I tell you, I get so excited. All right, the veins going backwards are the same order in reverse, with one exception. And the one exception is that in terms of the veins, there is no segmental vein. Everything else is the same: interlobular, arcuate, interlobar, renal vein. The only difference in the veins is that there is no segmental. So for the veins, for the blue structures, we would have the interlobular veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins, which lead all the way to the renal vein. Good, nice and straightforward. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the nephron, and then I'm going to pause, and then we'll pick this up with the details of the nephron when we get to the second video of this series. But don't leave me yet, because the fun is just beginning. Okay, I mentioned to you before that it is in the renal cortex, in this outer rim, that we have the nephrons. And the nephrons are so important because this is the functional unit of the kidney. The nephrons are the things inside the kidney that actually filter the blood and produce the urine. We have millions of nephrons squished into the renal cortex. This picture on the right is showing you the yellow structure, the coils and all that. This is one nephron. Now, of course, in real life, the nephron isn't that big. Nephrons are microscopic, but they're just showing us this larger picture so we can learn it better. Also, the nephron isn't always organized into this nice series of tubules. If I go ahead a couple of slides, we can see what the nephrons really look like. So in reality, all the parts of the nephrons, they're kind of smushed together into the renal cortex. But for ease of understanding, they magnify the yellow structure here so we can learn the parts. All right, what we're going to find is that there are two parts to each nephron. The renal corpuscle is the first part, and the second part are a series of tubules. Cool. So, the renal corpuscle. Corpuscle means round. As a matter of fact, red blood cells are often called corpuscles because they're round. So this part, this ball right here, is the renal corpuscle. First part of the nephron. The second part of the nephron are a series of tubules called the renal tubules. All right, there we go. We're going to talk more about them in a minute, or on the next video, I should say. We can also see that the renal corpuscle is in the renal cortex only, whereas parts of the renal tubules come down into the medulla. So the renal corpuscle is only in the renal cortex, but indeed, parts of the tubules go down into the medulla, and that's okay. I'm just pointing out that anatomical designation. I don't like when we can't see the whole thing, so let me just circle it again. All right. Now, I want to add some functions because I think it's a good time to set the stage. You may not agree, but I'm a professional. Try this at home. Okay, we can begin to understand the functions. So if we were to break the functions down very simply, we would see that it is the first part of the nephron, or the renal corpuscle. This is the part of the nephron that filters blood. Look at that. that first renal corpuscle, the round thing, that filters the blood, which means that the renal tubules, they function to form urine. We are, of course, going to talk much more detailed about this, but we can begin to lay the foundation. Okay, the nephron. The first part of the nephron is a renal corpuscle, and its job is to filter the blood. The second part of the nephron, the renal tubules, and their job is to form urine. All right, cool. We're going to end this first video, and I'll see you in a minute for the second.